I thought owning a quiet little piece of land outside the city would finally give me peace. Until the day I drove out there and found rows of brand new houses stretching across my property, like a fully built neighborhood I never approved. No permits, no warning. Just an HOA claiming I was trespassing on their community, a community they had secretly built on land that legally still belonged to me. By the time lawyers got involved, one terrifying truth became clear. According to the law, every single one of those homes now belonged to me. But how do you tell an entire HOA they accidentally handed you their whole neighborhood? Before everything unraveled, the land was supposed to be the simplest part of my life. It was 40 acres of quiet, open space on the edge of a fast-growing town. A place I'd inherited from my grandfather, who used to say it was the one thing in the world no one could ever take from us. I didn't live on it. I didn't farm it. I just kept it as it was, untouched, peaceful, and always waiting for whenever I needed a break from the noise of the world. Most days, I lived in a modest home across town, working long hours and dealing with the normal stresses of everyday life. Bills, deadlines, appointments. Nothing dramatic, nothing outrageous. That land was my escape, a quiet corner of the map I could depend on. If I ever needed to decompress, I'd grab some coffee, make the drive out, sit on the hood of my car, and just breathe. No neighbors, no rules, no permission slips to exist. Until the growth started. Every month, I heard about some new development popping up, a new subdivision breaking ground, a new master-planned community. More traffic, more noise, more HOAs with their pristine signs and endless rule books. The town was becoming a patchwork of tiny kingdoms, each run by boards convinced they were governing a nation instead of a neighborhood. I didn't pay much attention to it. At least, not at first. The land was zoned, surveyed, fenced, and fully recorded in my name. It wasn't on the market. It wasn't up for grabs. There was no reason for anyone to look twice at it. And so I kept living my life, not realizing how much was happening just a few miles away from me, or how bold people can become when they think no one is watching. But the first hint of trouble came quietly. A letter from the county, folded into my usual stack of mail, asking me to verify recent development activity. The wording was vague, almost confusing. Something about site alterations and infrastructure inquiries. I assumed it was a mistake. Maybe they mixed up parcel numbers. Maybe someone nearby had begun a project, and their paperwork drifted into my hands. I didn't think twice. I placed the letter aside and forgot about it. Weeks later, another letter arrived, this one asking about access roads. Again, confusing. Again, probably an error. I shrugged it off. Life was busy. I didn't have the energy to chase clerical mistakes, and besides, nothing ever happened on that land. It was still the same stretch of quiet earth I'd seen my entire life. At least, that's what I thought. Looking back, there were other signs too. Subtle ones that didn't raise alarms at the time. A neighbor mentioning all the construction going on out by your acreage. A coworker joking that developers were building faster than the town could keep up. Even a local news clip talking about the huge new HOA community being built on the outskirts. I didn't connect it to my land. Why would I? Human nature is funny. We never expect something bizarre to be happening behind our backs, until it's too late to ignore. I think the moment everything truly shifted was the day I opened my email and saw a message from a realtor I'd never spoken to. She congratulated me on allowing the partnership with Horizon Bluff Estates to proceed so smoothly, and offered her Continued support during the final stages. Horizon Bluff Estates. I stared at the name, trying to place it. It sounded fancy. Maybe a little pretentious. The kind of neighborhood where the HOA's monthly newsletter is thicker than most town budgets. But it meant nothing to me. I hadn't partnered with anyone. I hadn't approved anything. I hadn't even been out to the land in months. Yet somehow, someone thought I had. The email stuck with me the rest of the day. Something felt off. Wrong in a way I couldn't quite explain. There's a certain instinct you get when something starts shifting beneath your feet, when something familiar begins to twist just slightly out of shape. You don't have proof yet. You don't have evidence. You just feel it, like the tension in the air before a storm. So the next morning, I decided to drive out to the property, expecting nothing more than a quick look around. Maybe someone had installed a new utility pole nearby. Maybe a road crew had messed up the mapping. Maybe, hopefully, it would all be some minor misunderstanding that I'd laugh about later. But as I turned down the dirt road that led toward my land, something unexpected appeared through the trees. The faint, unnatural shape of something that didn't belong. Straight lines, angles, roofs. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Then, as I got closer, the shape sharpened into buildings, not sheds, not construction equipment, homes, rows of them. My quiet escape was gone. And I had no idea yet that what I was seeing wasn't just illegal. It was about to flip an entire HOA's world upside down and put me in a position neither they nor I ever expected, because this wasn't one house, or 2, or 10. It was an entire neighborhood, built on land that legally still belonged to me. And the people who built it had no idea what they'd done. The first few seconds after I pulled onto my land felt unreal, as if my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. Neatly paved streets cut through the middle of the property where there had once been nothing but dirt and wild grass. Rows of identical homes, pristine siding, manicured lawns, decorative street lamps, stretched so far back that the horizon itself seemed to blur. Children's bikes leaned against garage doors. Cars were parked in driveways. Mailboxes stood in perfect lines like soldiers guarding territory that, legally, still belonged to me. And in the center of it all stood a massive sign, polished and branded with an embossed logo: Horizon Bluff Estates. An HOA community. For a long moment, all I could do was stare. My stomach flipped violently, and a cold rush of confusion and anger flooded through me. It wasn't just the shock of seeing homes on my land. It was the realization that these houses weren't just being built. They were finished. People were living in them. People were living on my property without my permission, and an HOA. A fully established, fully operational HOA was running it. When I stepped out of my car and walked toward the nearest house, I expected someone to run out, demand to know who I was, call security, call the cops. Something. Instead, a resident pushing a stroller smiled, nodded politely, and continued on their walk. No suspicion. No alarm. To them, I must have just looked like another neighbor in the community. That illusion shattered when a white golf cart turned the corner, driven by a man wearing sunglasses, a clipboard balanced on his knee. The kind of clipboard that looked like it had been used to ruin a lot of people's weeks. He slowed as he approached me. Not to greet me. Not to ask if I needed help. But to glare. The territorial glare of someone who saw me as an intruder. Inside his golf cart sat a badge clipped to his shirt: HOA board president. My pulse pounded as he stopped right in front of me. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a hello. He simply looked at me like I was trespassing in broad daylight. Then he asked, with a tone dripping in passive, aggressive authority, if I understood that non-residents aren't permitted to freely roam community grounds. I didn't even know how to respond. Instead, I told him, calmly but firmly, that this was my land, not theirs, not the HOA's, not the residents', mine, and I had the deed to prove it. He laughed. An actual, condescending laugh. He told me I must be confused. That Horizon Bluff Estates had purchased the land 2 years ago. That I needed to check with whoever previously owned it, if I had concerns. He even suggested I contact the HOA office, as if I were some random troublemaker, looking to pick a fight. The arrogance in his voice was staggering. When I insisted again that I was the owner, his patience evaporated. He took out a pen, flipped a page on his clipboard, and wrote something down, slowly, deliberately, like a teacher marking a misbehaving student's name on the board. Then he told me he would be issuing me a violation citation for trespassing on Horizon Bluff property and advised me to leave before additional consequences were added. A violation citation on my land. From that moment, everything shifted. The shock faded. The adrenaline burned off. And what settled in its place was a cold, steady anger, not the explosive kind, but the kind that builds quietly and makes you dangerous. I walked away. Not because he told me to, but because I needed answers. Real ones. Fast. The county office became my first stop. I showed every document I had, my deed, the plat map, the tax statements. Everything. The clerk's expression shifted from routine politeness to deep concern. Then she brought out the county's development log for my parcel. What I saw was a nightmare. Someone, some company, some developer, had filed construction notices, utility requests, and zoning updates. None of the entries listed my name. None had my signature. All had been approved, stamped, and processed. But every single document had one glaring problem: the listed seller, the supposed previous owner, was a person I had never met. Someone who didn't exist in any records tied to my land. A ghost owner. A fake seller. Someone had forged the ownership transfer of my land and gotten it through planning, construction, inspection, the entire process, without anyone questioning it. By the time I left the county building, my calm anger had evolved into something sharper. I hired a lawyer immediately. Within hours, he discovered what the HOA president had conveniently omitted. Horizon Bluff Estates had never officially purchased the land. Their entire development stood on a foundation of fraudulent documents and illegal assumptions. According to state law, because the land was still legally mine and the transfer was never valid, every structure built on it was now my property. All 100 homes, all streets, all utilities, all common areas, everything. The HOA had accidentally built an entire neighborhood for me. One I never asked for and didn't authorize. But when word began to leak that the landowner was stepping forward, the HOA didn't respond with apologies or negotiations. They responded with aggression. It started with letters, thick envelopes stuffed with legal-sounding accusations. Trespassing, interference, harassment. They claimed I was disrupting the peaceful enjoyment of the community. They demanded I cease unauthorized visits to what they still insisted was their property. Then came the fines. Not symbolic threats, actual fines. $500 per occurrence for unauthorized presence, $1,000 for impeding HOA operations, $2,000 for creating hostile conditions for residents. The fines arrived almost daily, each more absurd than the last, each written with smug confidence, as if their rulebook outweighed state property law. My attorney laughed when he saw them. Not because they were funny, but because the HOA seemed blissfully unaware of just how cornered they really were. Their entire community sat on stolen ground, and instead of owning up to it, they doubled down. Residents began complaining too, though not always directly. Some left notes under my windshield when I drove through. Some took pictures like I was some suspicious prowler. One even shouted across the street that people like me didn't belong in their neighborhood. People like me, the actual landowner. But the HOA wanted control so badly that they were willing to rewrite reality, even as the legal pressure tightened around them. The next escalation came in the form of a cease and desist letter. Not from the HOA, but from their attorneys. They demanded I stop claiming ownership of Horizon Bluff Estates and threatened legal action if I didn't comply. My attorney drafted a response so forceful, so meticulously backed by property law, that the HOA's legal team went silent for 2 weeks. During that silence, something interesting happened. A handful of residents started reaching out privately. Quiet messages, anonymous emails, softly spoken conversations away from HOA cameras. They weren't angry like the others. They were scared. They'd bought homes believing everything was legitimate. Many were retirees who'd sunk their life savings into what they'd been told was a safe community. Some worked 2 jobs just to afford the mortgages. Now they feared losing everything. Not because of me, but because their HOA had built them a neighborhood without legally owning the land beneath it. Still, not everyone felt that way. The HOA president, the man who had tried to find me on day 1, escalated things to a new level of insanity. He sent an official notice, declaring that any future appearance I made on HOA property would be considered criminal trespass and reported to local authorities. His confidence was astonishing. He genuinely believed he could weaponize law enforcement against the rightful owner of the property. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came a week later, when I visited the land again and found something taped to nearly every door in the community. A letter from the HOA board claiming that I was attempting to steal the neighborhood, and that the residents must stand united against external threats. Painted me as a villain, a thief, an outsider trying to tear apart the community. The propaganda was so dramatic it bordered on comedic, except these were real people, scared and misled, being fed lies in the hope that public pressure would make me back down. It didn't. In fact, it only pushed me forward faster. My lawyer filed notice of ownership with the county, formally triggering the next steps. The HOA couldn't ignore it anymore. They couldn't hide behind threats, fines, or fake authority. The truth was coming. And that's when the final escalation hit. One morning, as I arrived on the property, I noticed something different. The golf cart, the clipboard, the sunglasses. The HOA president was waiting for me. In the middle of the road. Arms crossed, jaw tight, chest puffed like he was preparing for battle. Behind him stood nearly a dozen residents, their faces tense, confused, or fearful. Some held signs, some held cameras, some just stared, waiting to see what would happen. The president walked up to me, inches from my face, and told me in a low, icy voice that I was now banned from Horizon Bluff Estates indefinitely. Then, he said something that made my blood run cold. He told me the residents had voted to treat my presence as a security threat. A security threat to a community that illegally sat on my land. The showdown was coming. The legal hammer was about to fall. And the HOA had no idea just how catastrophic the next step would be for them. Because I wasn't just coming back with paperwork. I was coming back with the law. And the law said, they had built 100 homes. for me, and the climax of this battle was about to make that truth impossible for anyone to ignore. The morning of the showdown felt unnervingly quiet. The kind of quiet that happens right before a thunderstorm breaks open the sky. Everything in me knew the confrontation was inevitable, but nothing prepared me for just how explosive it would become, or how publicly everything would unravel for the HOA once the truth finally tore through their manufactured narrative. My attorney and I arrived early, long before the scheduled emergency hearing the HOA had demanded. A last-ditch attempt to legally block me from interfering with community operations. They believed the meeting would cement their authority. They believed their rulebook could override state law. They believed their board, their bylaws, and their self-important signatures had more weight than a deed carrying my family's name. What they didn't know was that my attorney had spent the last 48 hours assembling a collection of evidence so airtight that even the most HOA sympathetic judge couldn't ignore it. Forged signatures, mismatched notary stamps, fraudulent land transfers, illegal development permits, and the biggest blow of all, a county official prepared to testify that every approval Horizon Bluff Estates had obtained rested on falsified ownership documents. The second we entered the community center, a building they had also illegally constructed on my land, the atmosphere hit me like a wall. The board sat in a rigid line at the front, chins high, expressions sour. Rows of residents filled the seats, whispering nervously, some glaring at me, others watching with wide, uncertain eyes. Phone cameras were already pointed at me, ready to catch a trespasser being put in his place. The HOA president stood at the center of it all, the clipboard replaced with a thick binder, full of violations he had written against me. He wore the smug confidence of a man who truly believed the room belonged to him. But the confidence began to crack when my attorney set down a stack of evidence so thick it made the board members flinch. Things unraveled fast. The HOA president began the meeting with practiced arrogance, reading from a prepared speech about unwelcome interference and threats to community harmony. He talked about how I had disrupted family environments, how I refused to respect private property. HOA, every right to protect its residents from unstable individuals. Words were polished, rehearsed, weaponized, and then my attorney stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply laid out a single sheet of paper. The original, notarized deed showing my name, my grandfather's name, and the legal continuity that had never been broken. The room went silent. Then he revealed the second sheet. The fraudulent transfer document. The one that the developer had used to claim ownership. The one that listed a seller who did not exist. The one signed by a notary who, according to state databases, had been deceased for over a year before the document was created. A ripple went through the crowd. Gasps, whispers, stiffened spines. The HOA president's face drained of color. My attorney didn't stop there. Page after page of evidence followed, emails between the developer and the HOA board referencing expedited approvals, county forms missing required signatures, inspection reports marked conditional that had somehow been filed as passed, utility requests bearing mismatched addresses. The residents began murmuring louder now, some turning in their seats to look at the board with widening horror. But the real blow came when the county official stepped forward and calmly stated, for the whole room to hear, that the county had never received a valid land transfer for Horizon Bluff Estates, that the HOA had built 100 homes on land that did not legally belong to them, and that, Under state law, I was the sole legal owner of the land and all structures upon it. The room erupted. Some residents stood up shouting. Others slumped forward, hands over their faces. A few stared at the board with open betrayal, their dreams of peaceful retirement or safe family living shattering right in front of them. The HOA president tried to regain control, slamming his binder shut, shouting that none of this mattered, that the community had voted, that the homeowners association had authority over all properties within its predetermined boundaries. That word, predetermined, was the final nail in his coffin. The county official calmly explained that their boundaries were drawn illegally. Their entire map was void. Their HOA had jurisdiction over nothing more than the paper their rules were printed on. The president's voice cracked, desperation seeping into his tone. He insisted the community was private property. He insisted I was the intruder. He insisted the residents didn't want me among them. As if that changed the law. That's when everything snapped. A resident, an older woman with trembling hands, stood up and demanded to know how the board had purchased homes built on stolen land. Another man shouted that he'd spent his life savings on a home the HOA told him was secure. Someone else accused the board of hiding the truth. The president tried to shout them down, but his own board members were beginning to crack. Whispering fiercely amongst themselves, panic and fear replacing their earlier arrogance. It was chaos, furious, emotional, impossible to contain chaos. And then, in the middle of that storm, my attorney dropped the final bombshell. He announced that our next step was to file for full legal possession of every structure on the land, including each of the 100 homes. The HOA president erupted, screaming that this was theft, extortion, blackmail. He slammed his fists on the table, shouting for security to remove us, shouting that we were violating community policy. My attorney calmly reminded him that he had no legal authority to remove anyone from land that wasn't his. That's when the moment finally came. The one that would burn itself into my memory forever. The president lunged forward, shoving the table so hard that papers scattered across the floor. He pointed at me, rage contorting his face, spitting threats through clenched teeth. He shouted that he would never let some outsider take what we built here. And for the first time in the entire confrontation, I responded. I stepped forward, leveled my gaze at him, and said, slowly, clearly, so the entire room could feel the weight of it, that they had built all of this on someone else's land. Built it without permission. Built it illegally. Built it for me. The quiet that followed was suffocating. Residents stared at him, realization dawning in their eyes. Board members backed away. The county official stepped between us. And the HOA president, shaking with fury and defeat, was forced to sit down as the entire room watched his authority crumble. The judge, who had been listening silently from the back as an observer, stepped forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her ruling was swift, devastating, and irreversible. The HOA's emergency petition was denied. The land legally belonged to me. All structures built on it were now mine. And the HOA was hereby ordered to suspend all operations pending investigation. The president sank into his chair, staring blankly at the table, the reality of his downfall settling over him like a weight he could no longer hold. Residents erupted again. Not with anger at me this time, but with fury at the board, demanding answers, demanding refunds, demanding accountability. And in the middle of it all, the HOA president slowly raised his head, eyes burning with hatred, not at his own mistakes, but at me, the one person he had spent months trying to bully into silence. he whispered, loud enough for his board, but not the crowd. This isn't over. But he was wrong. For him, for the HOA, for the fraudulent community they had built on stolen ground. It was over. What came next? The fallout, the consequences, the final resolution would shake the entire neighborhood harder than anything they'd faced yet. Because owning a house is one thing. Owning 100 homes you weren't supposed to build is another. And the aftermath was only beginning. In the days following the confrontation, the entire community seemed to hover in a strange, suspended reality, like a snow globe someone had shaken violently, and then set down just to watch where everything landed. Neighbors who had once marched in quiet rule, following unison under the HOA's every command, now found themselves scattered, confused, and desperate for answers. Some were angry. Some were devastated. Some were simply exhausted. And all of them were caught in the fallout of decisions they never knew their leadership had made. The board stopped sending out their usual polished newsletters. Their website went blank. Their weekly community unity walks disappeared overnight. It was as if the HOA itself had evaporated, leaving behind only the wreckage of what it had built, both physically and emotionally. Meanwhile, my attorney and I filed the official claims to assume legal possession of the property and all structures on it. At first, I felt almost numb as the reality set in. This wasn't just about one dispute, one letter, one rude board president with a clipboard. This was about an entire neighborhood that never should have existed. 100 families living in homes that weren't authorized. Streets paved across land that didn't belong to them. A community that was never legally theirs. Yet the situation wasn't black and white. The families weren't the ones who forged documents or exploited loopholes. They were victims too. Victims of a development company that cut corners, a county process that failed to catch red flags, and an HOA that had operated with unchecked arrogance for far too long. As the legal dust settled, the county launched a full-scale investigation into the developer behind Horizon Bluff Estates. The fraudulent land transfer, the forged notary stamps, the illegal permits. It all pointed to layers of corruption deeper than anyone expected. Government officials scrambled to cover their tracks, developers scrambled to hire attorneys, and the entire region suddenly became very interested in the land they had once ignored. The HOA board members were each called in for questioning. The president, who had once strutted around the neighborhood like a self-appointed monarch, now faced accusations of knowingly participating in fraudulent development. Whether he had been fully aware or simply complicit out of negligence barely mattered. The law was unforgiving when it came to forged documents and false filings. Residents, meanwhile, began organizing their own meetings, not controlled by an HOA this time, but by themselves. The tone was heartbreaking. They shared fears of losing their homes, of having nowhere to go, of seeing life savings evaporate because they had believed in good faith that the land beneath their feet was secure. The anger that had once been directed at me was now aimed squarely at the board and the developer. Some came to me directly, cautiously at first, then more openly. They apologized for the hostility. They apologized for the notes, the stares, the assumptions. It wasn't easy for them, and it would have been easy for me to hold on to bitterness. But the truth was, I didn't blame them. They had been fed a carefully crafted narrative by people who relied on fear to maintain control. And the more I spoke with them, the clearer it became that I had a choice to make. One that would shape not only my future, but the futures of everyone living on my land. By law, I could evict every single resident. I could bulldoze the homes. I could sell the land for millions to a developer who would build something legitimate. The law was on my side, and no judge would have questioned my right to do any of those things. But sometimes power is tested, not in how you fight for it, but in how you choose to use it. The residents weren't the enemy. They were casualties of a system that had failed them at every level. They deserved fairness, stability, and a chance to rebuild their lives without fear. So I made a decision, not one of revenge, but of restoration. Under the guidance of my attorney, I drafted a plan that would give every resident the option to legitimately purchase the land beneath their homes at fair market value. A value significantly lower than what a developer would pressure them into. Payment plans, flexibility, and the complete elimination of HOA interference were included. No fines, no ridiculous rules, no intimidation. Just a clean, legal path to security. For those who didn't want to stay, I offered buyout options that allowed them to relocate without financial ruin. When we announced the plan at a community-wide meeting, this time held outdoors under an open sky, the reaction was overwhelming. Some residents cried openly. Some hugged their spouses. Some apologized to me repeatedly, thanking me for giving them a chance they never expected. But not everyone showed gratitude. The former HOA president stood at the back of the crowd, arms crossed, face twisted in bitterness. He couldn't accept that his authority had been stripped away. He couldn't accept that the community he once controlled was now free from the grasp of his rulebook. And he especially couldn't accept that the man he had tried to bully, threaten, and banish was now the one offering the residents a lifeline. He tried to stir panic again, insisting my offer was a trap, insisting I was taking advantage of vulnerable families. But this time, no one listened. His power had evaporated the moment the truth came to light, and without his title, he was just another voice in a crowd of people who had finally seen through the facade. Legal consequences began catching up with him within months. Fraud charges, civil liability, a mountain of lawsuits from the very residents he once governed with an iron fist. The board members who had enabled him faced consequences too. Some financial, some legal, all deserved. The developer wasn't so lucky. They were hit with enough charges to topple their entire operation. Investigations widened. More victims from other communities came forward. What started as one illegal subdivision turned into a statewide scandal uncovering years of corruption. As for the community itself, something unexpected happened. Without the HOA, Horizon Bluff Estates didn't fall apart. It transformed. The rigid, anxiety-fueled atmosphere dissipated. The neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak openly now created their own informal support networks. Yard decorations appeared. Paint colors diversified. Families took evening walks without feeling watched. People lived, really lived, in a way they never could before under the oppressive weight of fines and citations. And gradually, the name, Horizon Bluff Estates, faded. The community adopted a new name chosen by the residents themselves, a symbol of new beginnings rooted in honesty and unity, not fear and control. For me, the impact was more personal. What began as a routine visit to peaceful land had spiraled into a battle I never anticipated. It tested my patience, my resilience, and my belief in fairness. It showed me how deep entitlement can run when people feel untouchable, and how quickly that illusion can crumble when confronted with truth. But more importantly, it taught me that justice doesn't always have to take the form of destruction. Sometimes the most powerful resolution comes from building something better from the ruins of something unjust. In the end, I didn't gain a neighborhood of homes I didn't want. I gained something far more meaningful: the knowledge that even when an entire system tries to push you out, silence you, or mislabel you as the villain, the truth has a way of rising, loudly, unmistakably, and with consequences no rulebook can contain. As I stood on the land one quiet evening months after the chaos had settled, the sun dipping behind the newly renamed community, I felt something I hadn't felt since this entire ordeal began. Peace. The land was still mine, legally, historically, undeniably. But now it was shared with people who genuinely valued it. And the weight of fear, hostility, and conflict had finally lifted. Looking back, it still feels surreal that an HOA tried to build an entire neighborhood on my property without permission. Surreal that they tried to bully me into silence. Surreal that they believed their rules held more power than the law itself. But the truth is simple. Sometimes the biggest battles we face aren't the ones we choose, they're the ones we're forced into by people who underestimate us. And sometimes, those battles lead to outcomes even more powerful than revenge. So here's the question I'll leave you with. The one that lingers long after the dust has settled. If an entire HOA built a neighborhood on your land and tried to drive you out, would you fight to destroy them? Or fight to set things right? Either way, they would never forget the day they built 100 homes for the wrong person.